It's wonderful to be with you all here today. And again, to be joining the United States Energy Association on an interactive dialogue on how we are approaching the future goals of the energy sector as partners and do so aggressively at scale to meet our global ambitions. It's useful and enjoyable as well to be here with my hat on at the university and provide a perspective of where might universities, research institutions, or thought leadership have a role in the overall energy transition. So we are often known, of course, for credit-bearing degree programs. Arizona State, as an example, has 140,000 students right now, and then also non-credit-bearing workforce development or training programs. ASU also trains about 2 million people per year in professional development programs on a variety of specialities. But my colleagues in here and I today are pursuing and growing that future engineers, operators, managers, and leaders of the energy transition, but also what are the new technologies, what are the new policies, what are the new customer value propositions much we seek to unlock what that future might be. And so collectively, what you'll hear from us today is a few things. I would say one is that when we look at innovation, it's not just in science. The types of levers and changes that we need to fulfill and see are combinations of innovations in technology, customer value propositions, business models, and most often also policy. And just in looking at one of those vectors, we might be suboptimal or subperform on our joint ambitions for transitioning to a low carbon and no carbon economy, while also, of course, maintaining low cost and reliable energy. The second thing, which I appreciate by these types of discussions and where universities can lean into, is an understanding of the global mega trends. And when I say this, obviously climate change is one of those. Extreme weather, extreme heat, hurricanes, a number of different climate forcings. Energy security is obviously a major topic today as well. Material shortages and how that'll affect battery manufacturing. Policy mandates and reporting scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and what those might be, displaced peoples, and then also other policy and other types of mandates. So how do those significant trends shaping the world today not just influence the energy sector directly, but influence actors of which the energy sector has as customers? And so looking at that, we must, in the third element that I would say, take a systems perspective and understanding the various elements, getting back to that point that I first mentioned, is that innovation is not just science, it's far broader than that. Realizing as well is that Arizona State, much like the National Science Foundation, champions this concept of use-inspired research. You can't do that from your office. And so what does that look like in the provision of not generation of electrons as a business model, but the provision of electricity as a service? So thinking about the customer in a different way, where is the motivation and the driver of your work? And again, at the end of the day, how is that use or that customer's desire and need then change the scope of what you do? Lastly, I would say is it's enjoyable for universities to be part of the dialogue, and I will emphasize and underscore that element part. Is that part is a portion of the word is partnership. And so with the United States Energy Association and other groups, unlocking and creating partnerships and networks is required to deliver on the goals and values that a university can, but also all of the other energy stakeholders. And not only together with the folks on this call, and then also locally and with other organizations around the world and underrepresented populations and organizations, so we can achieve our goals at the scale we want and the impact we want. And so with a number of my colleagues on the call today, 4 of them, we're going to go through a series of opening remarks and presentations on some of these work that underscores those themes. And then at the end, we'll have about a half an hour for a moderated Q&A. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ted Kury. He's the Director of Energy Studies at the University of Florida. Ted, please join us.
Thank you, Nate. And thank you very much to Sheila, to Vicky, to Dominic, to Kim, everybody that's responsible for getting me from here in my office in Gainesville to all of you at this forum. Next slide, please, Dominic. So for those of you who aren't familiar with PERC, we're a soft money center at the University of Florida within the Warrington College of Business. We're primarily involved in executive education. We deliver programs here in Gainesville and in country, primarily in Latin America and the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific Islands. We also engage in research projects, but our primary function is training regulators and utility operators in the regions that I mentioned. Next slide, please, Dominic. So what I'd like to talk a little bit about in my opening remarks is the growth of artificial intelligence and machine learning at universities. A lot of universities, UF included, have made substantial investments in new computing power to harness some of the data that we're collecting and use that data to offer practical solutions. And there are a lot of practical solutions within the utility industry. Universities are supplementing that with additional coursework in quantitative methods and quantitative analysis. Again, UF is only one example, but a number of universities I've seen over the past couple of years have really ramped up the faculty that they're bringing on board and their course offerings for the students. And that learning is not limited to just the classroom. You're seeing a lot more involvement with the private sector and putting the students together in experiential learning, where students are able to engage in real life projects that the utility or the regulator may not have the time. Certainly they have technical expertise, but a lot of their time is spent in making sure that they're providing safe, reliable service at just and reasonable rates. Their day-to-day operations, they may not have time to look into some of these projects. So it gives the students an interesting perspective on some of the real world challenges and gives the utilities access to students that have time on their hands, and you give them a data set. There are all sorts of things that they can do with it. Next slide, please, Dominic. So I'd just like to briefly talk about two of these projects. And when we go into the discussion, I'm sure we'll talk about a lot more applications. But the first one is an interesting application looking at the behavior of remote meters. So we've got a utility here in Florida that in their remote metering system, they're finding that they periodically lose communication with the meters. Sometimes it's for just a couple of minutes, sometimes it's an hour, sometimes it's a little bit longer. And the question they're always faced with is, at what point do they have to swap out the meter? Because that's going to be an additional expense to swap out the meter. You've got the you've got the worker that has to go out, or the crew that has to go out. You've got the expense of the meter. So they don't really want to swap out a meter that they don't have to. They don't want to make a site visit if they don't have to. So one of the ways they've engaged with some folks here at the business school is taking a look at these patterns of communication interruptions with the meters. At what point do you signal that the meter has gone bad? At what point are you looking at it and saying, well, we lost communication for a little bit, but the meter came back online? It's an ongoing project, so I wish I could share results with you, but I can't. But it's an ongoing effort to look at what is really the optimal time to replace a meter, to take a line worker's or a meter technician's part of their day to go out to a site and swap out a meter. Next slide, please, Dominic. And then the other project I want to talk about, which is near and dear to my heart, it's one of my current research efforts, is focusing on unregistered solar PV installations. Countries around the world, unregistered solar PV installations are a big problem. They pose a significant safety threat to not only utility workers, but the general public at large. The Dutch grid operator a couple of years ago did a study where they estimated that roughly 60% of their solar PV installations were unregistered. A recent study from an area of Cape Town found that 70% of the solar installations were unregistered. The grid operator in the Philippines recently looked at the problem and estimated that almost 80% of their solar PV installations are unregistered. Now, that may not be a problem right here in the United States, but it's important to note that as more states reconsider net metering, as a compensation mechanism for solar PV, you actually create an incentive for unregistered PV installations because, well, let's face it, if nobody knows that you have a PV installation at your house, well, you effectively have net metering, right? So what we've been doing is trying to refine some of the existing methods for detection. Most of those detection methods right now include satellite photos and image processing software. It's really expensive. It's also not very reliable. So what we're looking at is an AI routine using billing data. So commonly available billing data for the utilities, very inexpensive, and our preliminary results suggest that we're getting much higher detection rates. So satellite photos detection rates are ranged between 5 and 10%. We're getting detection rates more in the magnitude of 50 to 60%. So huge jump and a lot less expense. It's still a work in progress. There's still elements of the neural net that we are developing, but it's exciting aspect, applications of AI and machine learning that I think is going to expand the knowledge we have in the utility sector. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you a lot.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ted. And I really appreciate the application of AI to understand and investigate where there might be unregistered solar PV installations, as you're indicating. That is, one, important to know, and two, presents a potential significant safety hazard as well. So thank you for diagnosing and sharing that information. A few questions will follow up in our moderation, so we'll check back with you then. Next up kindly is Tracy Hester, who's a professor in the University of Houston Law Center. Tracy, please take the stage.
Great, thank you so much. And as always, it's a great pleasure to be invited to participate, especially anything with the U.S. Energy Association. I understand that I have around 5 minutes to set some opening remarks, which usually it takes me 5 minutes to tell an opening joke. So I'm going to end up skipping lightly at a high level on several areas. But one, I'd like to focus on just how the traditional model of universities as incubators for energy industry and sectors is transitioning along with the industry itself as it transitioned. Second, I'd like to focus a little bit on the perspective that we bring here, for me in particular, at the University of Houston Law Center and the legal projects that we're undertaking in conjunction with that effort. And then last, include a few examples of projects underway that might help set the smorgasbord for our discussion after everyone finishes presentations. So with that, I just wanted to begin by stressing that the university systems, at least in Texas, have actually played a fairly broad role beyond simply providing a greenhouse for new ideas and innovations. So, and by the way, I should say, I'm not seeing an image. Are y'all hearing me and seeing me?
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you. So as a result, universities have actually done multiple roles. In particular, we've provided not only technology development and basic research ideas, but we also have played a role in terms of developing the workforces by providing access to youth who want to consider these issues and explore possibilities, as well as a neutral forum for discussing contentious issues. All three of those sectors have been explicit focuses for us here at the University of Houston and have been very active, in particular with the transition. To give some examples, I'll start with more traditional examples and then move into some of the more energetic ones that are underway right now in our region of the country. One would be the Subsea Systems Institute, which is actually one of the centers of excellence set up with some of the REACH funding after the Deepwater Horizon funding settlement. It consists of a collaboration between the University of Houston, Rice, and Johnson Space Center at NASA. The idea of it basically performing research and developing protocols to enhance safety and productivity at ultra deep well production, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico. That is a classic example of how universities have provided and intersected with the energy sector in the multiple ways I've just described: technology, fundamental research, and helping develop a workforce that would be able to engage and do that work in the future. Another great example, and maybe you already know them, is the University of Texas Bureau of Economic Geology, which has for decades provided excellent nonpartisan support for information in terms of development of energy sources and the impacts of that development. As, however, the sector is transitioning to include things beyond hydrocarbons, we are starting to see that same sort of focus porting over into other areas. The one I'd like to discuss is the one that I'm a co-director of here at the University of Houston, the Center for Carbon Management and Energy. It is an entity that is set up that encompasses all of the colleges of the entire university system. So it is explicitly designed to do multidisciplinary research and advocacy. Advocacy in the sense of developing policies and developing technologies. In that regard, we have a combination of faculty working with industry partners and sponsors, and we are trying to identify not only emerging issues and policies, but also areas of research of joint interest to up to, right now, I think our current list of industry partners is around 13. To give some examples, we've just issued seed funding for a dozen projects. Some of those projects include, for example, detecting CO2 leaks from deep subsea sequestration sites, providing for one-step transfer of captured CO2 and direct air capture units into fuel, providing an assessment of depleted oil and gas reserves in the Gulf of Mexico for CO2 storage. All of these are underway with collaboration with industry participants to make sure that the issues that are being investigated are actually yielding useful, credible outputs. On a bit more generic level, we're also, the university systems, very actively involved, and I suspect all of our panelists are looking at some of these, with the development of hubs. Obviously, the Department of Energy's request for proposals for the hydrogen hubs, for the direct air capture hubs, with the CCS developments, all given turbocharges from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. Right now, that is an extremely fertile area of activity underway right now. And then at the highest level and more long-term, y'all are probably familiar with the National Science Foundation's initiative to create energy innovation incubators. Essentially, these are designed to be large multi-sector efforts to provide a favorable setting for the development of innovative new ideas as part of the energy transition. It explicitly includes industry, academia, NGOs. Is meant to be as broad as possible, inclusive as possible, and creative as possible. So keeping moving along, I'm not sure how much time I have left, but let me just mention a few specific ideas, things that we're working on here. In particular, the Gulf Coast, we are actually seeing a quiet land rush underway, where there are attempts to essentially, by contract, obtain pre-commitments on pore space for future large-scale, megaton-scale CO2 sequestration. That's raised some very tricky issues in terms of clarifying pore space ownership, particularly in Texas. We're working on those issues. We're looking at the development of large-scale negative emissions technologies and carbon dioxide removal, as well as potentially at some point in the future, acceleration management. We're actually having, for the first in the country, classes teaching the legal and policy implications of those technologies as they're deployed at some scale. And also the Houston Energy Transition Initiative, which is an actual collaboration to actually map out a future pathway for the Gulf Coast energy sector to develop a clear, productive and safe move to a future decarbonized energy system. And then last, just personally, I'll just mention the thing that's on my desk right now is carbon bankruptcy and climate reorganization. As corporate entities are looking at ways to reduce their potential exposure for asset stranding or liability judgments, what sort of actions are being taken place now through either proactive spin-offs, reorganizations, or bankruptcy declarations to essentially cabin that possible carbon liability in the future? I'm glad to talk about those issues, but I think my 5 minutes probably elapsed 2 minutes ago. So I'll pass the baton back to you.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you so much. And we'll continue this race and lap around the track. I really appreciate, as well as you're talking about the Center for Carbon Management and Energy. And again, that connects back to the systems thinking principles, which are themes today about connecting the thoughts and needs across multiple disciplines. And so thanks for sharing that insight and mindset with us today as well. Next up kindly is Tom Richard. He's the Director of Institutes for the Energy and the Environment, kindly at Penn State University. Tom, if you'll join us, please.
Thank you, Nate, and thanks to USEA, Sheila, Vicki, Kim, Dominic, this whole team, and great to be back with you. And I will mention I am actually, as of a couple of weeks ago, no longer the Director of the Institutes of Energy and the Environment at Penn State. I'm very happy to have passed on that mantle to Bruce Logan, who's with the National Academy of Engineering and hopefully can participate in future years. I wanted to mention a couple of things. First of all, I think many of you know from previous interactions with me and others at Penn State, we are a full-service energy university. We've got hundreds of faculty teaching thousands of students in 18 different energy majors, and so we're all in on energy. And there's a lot of exciting work going on everything from grid management to solid state batteries and flow batteries to next generation nuclear. I'm going to zero in on carbon negative fuels, in part because it was complementary to what some of the other university folks are sharing, and some of the things that came up earlier today in some of the earlier panels. Next. And I want to just remind us all that as we try to decarbonize our energy systems, we're not actually making adequate progress on reducing emissions. And every year that we don't, we're going to need more and more negative emissions to get us to a climate neutral or back to a climate friendly world. And each of those alternatives for negative emissions have some challenges. We heard about the carbon earthshot earlier this morning from Secretary Granholm and others, and that's an expensive technology right now, and it will be energy expensive forever, just based on the thermodynamics of trying to take 400 part per million carbon out of the atmosphere. But we need to do it, and we need to scale up these negative emissions technologies. And I'm going to talk today, really focus in on biomass and photosynthesis as a strategy. So next, next slide. One of the things that very few people appreciate is that the terrestrial carbon cycle is really dominated by plants. There's 10 times as much CO2 removed from the atmosphere each year by photosynthesis as there is from all fossil emissions combined. And those negative emissions are not only substantial, but they're largely managed by people. Estimates are that about half of the photosynthesis on the planet is managed through either agriculture or forestry. So we have a pretty large economic activity in this carbon removal already, but we don't really think about it very much in that framework. There's a lot of interest. Just last week, Secretary Vilsack from the Department of Agriculture announced $2.8 billion of new projects for climate smart agriculture and forestry. But that was mostly land-based work. And what we need to do is think about the entire value chain, and particularly taking some of the biomass that is captured carbon and using it in more effective ways, and recognizing that every one of those molecules of CO2 that's been captured is really quite precious, and we need to do more with it. Right now, an awful lot of it goes to respiration, increasing amounts to fire, disease, pests, et cetera. And so we need to manage that whole system more effectively. Next. And I want to just share a little bit of data from a paper we published a couple years ago, looking at biofuel economic systems and drivers and comparing them with ecosystem carbon storage. And we looked at situations where we would take land and could really equalize those different options. And over on the right, you see in at least the 3 locations of the U.S. that we looked at really closely across the country, grassland restoration and reforestation might be able to capture on the order of 1 to 3 megagrams of carbon per hectare per year, which is roughly in the same space as some of our current biofuel technologies. But we can do a lot better than that. And some of the work that's being done in the laboratories at universities and national labs, and increasingly in companies at pilot plants, is producing a lot more fuel from biomass than we were able to and have been doing commercially so far. But the other thing that's coming on really strong is carbon capture. And one of the things that I want to really drive home today is that biofuels can be thought of as a vehicle towards carbon capture, where both the microbial processes of converting biomass into fuels and the thermochemical processes such as Fischer-Tropsch catalysis, those systems actually throw off large quantities of carbon dioxide as part of their process, and it's usually very pure. So there's a lot of that that's already available, and there are billion-dollar pipelines already being developed in the Midwest to capture the corn ethanol CO2 that right now is largely wasted. Let's see, if you could double-click and just point out that one of the things I think we need to think about moving forward is how do we think not just about the fuel offset, which as we see electrification in vehicles and other alternative fuel options is going to be less and less important in our carbon management over time. And how do we get more of the carbon into CO2 and the energy into hydrogen bonds, including pure hydrogen, but also things like methane. Right now, renewable natural gas is about 98% of the cellulosic biofuel in this country, and that's an industry that did not exist a decade ago. So there's really rapid movement. And separating the hydrogen bonds from the carbon bonds and getting the carbon as much as possible to CO2 and the hydrogen as much as possible to energy is something we actually know how to do with work going on in that area in methane for actually over 100 years. Double click again. And I think we also need to think more carefully about all the residues from these processes, and particularly the carbon that could go into soil and materials. And I'll talk more about that in the next slide. Go ahead and click again, Dominic. So this is just an illustration of several different biofuel technologies. And the gray in the upper part of each of these bar charts is the carbon that is in the fuel, and that if you burn that fuel in a vehicle or a jet airplane, is not going to be very easy to capture. It's heavy. We don't have carbon capture technology that will work in those distributed energy combustion systems, but it's actually a relatively small part of the carbon. And the dark green parts of the bar are the high purity carbon dioxide or fermentation residues, which are about 50% carbon, that are byproducts of that process and that we're really not adding or considering as very valuable right now. Sometimes in some of the scenarios we do combust those solids, but I would argue that's not a really brilliant strategy, because what we're doing is taking this material that's about 50% solids and we're turning it back into 400 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And there are much smarter things we can do with that. We are seeing, as I mentioned, biogas going into renewable natural gas, and we're now starting to see renewable natural gas going to hydrogen, which throws off even more pure CO2 in the processes that are available. And I wanted to mention that there's a lot of work now going on thinking about these biomass processes as vehicles for carbon storage. I'll share a quote from Dan Sanchez, who's at the University of California, Berkeley, and from 2015. It's in the bottom right, and I won't read it to you, but he pointed out and was one of the first people to note that this is really the value of these processes with bioenergy combined with carbon capture and storage are in carbon sequestration as much or more than their energy values. And just to illustrate that more, if you could click, Dom, some of those things for those large quantities of carbon that I've boxed out with the colored boxes are biochar, soil carbon, carbon-based materials. I mentioned separating the fuel molecules to get more into hydrogen and then CO2 that is pure streams and sequesterable. And then putting that CO2 into sequestration and carbon-based materials. Next, so I've put together what I call the photosynthesis rules. You can take that phrase two different ways, but I do think as we think about our energy systems, we have to think about the bioeconomy as well and how our fuels can connect to that. Growing more plants, increasing the carbon storage in soils and ecosystems, and harvesting biomass sustainably, of course. But how do we actually build a bioeconomy and an energy economy that takes advantage of the 3.5 billion years of photosynthesis and the massive amounts of CO2 that process is already removing each year from the atmosphere? Thanks very much, and pass it back to Nate.
Excellent, Tom. Thanks for the presentation. I appreciate those closing remarks. I think next meeting I'm gonna run with Tom's photosynthesis rules of order. So excellent. Thanks again for sharing. I'm gonna have some follow-up questions, particularly on value chains for you here in a few minutes. Next up kindly is Bob Armstrong. He's the director of MIT Energy Initiative. Bob, please join us. Do we have Bob with us today? Dominic?
I'm with you. I don't know how to get large here.
Perfect. Thanks for joining. Yep, we can see and hear you.
You can see me okay?
Yep.
Okay. So thanks for having me. It's great to join this session. I'm going to start with just saying a word or two about the MIT Energy Initiative, MITI, as we pronounce the acronym. MITI launched back in the end of 2006 as a hub to bring MIT's faculty from all of our schools and now College of Computing together to address the grand energy challenges. Over the 15 years since we launched, we have now engaged about a third, a little more than a third of the MIT faculty. So maybe 350 faculty or so from all departments and all schools and college at MIT. That's important because the challenges we face, I think, require that we have all of the disciplines that we can bring to the table, not just science and engineering, but also economics, policy, business, architecture and planning, computing. Bring all those to the table to look at the big drivers that we face in the energy challenge. And those are climate change. How do we develop low carbon pathways, zero carbon pathways, negative carbon pathways? We've heard some of that already today. How we guarantee energy access to everyone. Right now, there are roughly 1 billion people around the world who have no access to energy and many more who have inadequate access. And then lastly, energy security. How do we provide secure energy systems post-transition, recognizing that these systems need to be resilient. We need to ensure diversity of supply and well-functioning markets. An initiative that we launched quite recently at MITI, just this past year, is a Future Energy System Center. I bring that up because I think it speaks to the challenge or the opportunity that Nate mentioned around systems thinking. We have been working, and others, you've heard other examples here, working on specific technologies and routes to a low carbon future for many years. Question is ultimately not what are the neat technologies we have, but how do you fit those together in order to ensure that we can deliver the energy services to people in affordable, resilient energy systems. So this Future Energy Systems Center brings together members of industries from our upstream mining companies to downstream automotive companies to work with us in identifying the challenges and opportunities across the parts of the energy sector, so power, industry, transportation, and buildings, and also cross-sector enablers, like carbon management, we just talked about some of that, and storage, low-carbon fuels that also cut across these different aspects of the energy system. As part of the activity we have been working at developing systems analysis tools. Some of these actually predate MITI by decades. Some are just maybe a decade older than MITI. But tools that let us look globally, economy-wide at coupled climate and economics issues. Combined TEA, LCA tools that let us look at energy pathways, either at an individual pathway level or combined into energy systems in very narrow regions in parts of the U.S. or in the U.S. as a whole or different parts of the world. And then finally, capacity expansion models that allow us to look at how, given a suite of technologies and costs for those technologies and policy scenarios, might you build out energy systems in the future in a economic, low-cost way. Last thing I'll mention is that I think universities play a unique role in helping to nurture startup companies and move those out into the startup space and ultimately to commercialization. Clearly, universities sit at the very front end of that process. But I think as we face the needs to scale more rapidly from ideas to commercial systems, we're working, and I'm sure others are working on ways to keep the university involved in those startups as long as is helpful to accelerate that move to commercialization. An example I'll give is a fusion company, which happens now to be the largest funder of the MIT Energy Initiative, Commonwealth Fusion Systems, which spun out of MIT 3 years ago. Commonwealth Fusion System is looking at ways through high temperature superconducting magnets to significantly reduce the time to get fusion to the market and reduce the cost and the size of the reactors needed to do that. I think an interesting lesson we're learning, I won't say we have learned from CFS, is that universities can not just bring the early ideas to the table, but can also be important where a startup company is not going to succeed with 3 people in a garage. CFS, they fund some $12 million a year at MIT on this project. They need access not just to this technology idea, but they need access to large numbers of human experts, human capital, and large access to financial capital for them to spin out quickly. So I think that's been an interesting experience for us. We're really excited about how CFS can play and make a huge difference in a carbon-constrained world, starting maybe 2035 or so as we start to bring fusion into the marketplace. So let me stop with that, and I can happy to elaborate on other ideas in these spaces.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bob. I really appreciate the remarks, and particularly with the concepts and driving forces with that Future Energy Systems Center, by looking at the future of the economy and how the connections between technologies, disciplines, people, industry, and more can create a new type of future together. If I'd invite kindly all of the panelists to kindly come off of muting their videos to join us today visually. And I'll start with a question, if I could actually, Bob, for you, peeking a little bit more into this Future Energy Systems Center. You mentioned this fusion company, and what I really appreciated about that is the incubation of energy ideas and energy businesses. And from my previous background in consumer products and fast-moving consumer goods, when we incubated businesses, it was far faster because the nature of that economic sector, much like the software sector, is far faster. The energy industry moves pretty slow. So how do you approach innovation and incubation in the energy sector for new ideas versus how you might approach it in a different economic sector? Wondering if you could give some guidance and structure to the folks joining us today.
Yeah, so there are a couple aspects of that. So one is the need for patient capital. MIT launched maybe 6-7 years ago an organization called The Engine. It spun out from MIT as a patient venture capital company. One of their focus areas is energy. And so they have at their core providing capital, but with much longer terms on expected return on that capital. So not the very short terms with, say, software, but upwards to 20 years for return of capital. So that's an important aspect of this. The second is that a lot of startups need space. So the engine provides a shared laboratory space and certain special equipment that companies can use. I mentioned for a company like CFS, that's not enough. You need to have large high bay area with special equipment that can deal with construction of the high temperature superconducting magnets that are core to the business. And there, MIT's Plasma Science and Fusion Center has proved to be essential. And so there are literally hundreds of research scientists devoted to that, both on the MIT side and on the CFS side. And then thirdly, the amount of capital, I think, is worth considering. So to build a reactor, a couple 100-megawatt reactor, is not something you can do on a shoestring with a couple of $1 million, which you could do in software. Their first round of funding to develop the magnet and demonstrate the magnet was $150 million, something on that order. Second round, so after the magnet was demonstrated, that was done successfully last September, they then raised second round of funding to actually build what they call Spark. It's a test reactor to demonstrate net power out, but using the full-scale magnets. And the fundraising for that phase, $1.8 billion. Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's a staggering amount of money when you think about it, but we need to think about where are we going to get that kind of capital for energy startups? Where do you get the human capital you need? And I think universities can play an innovative role there. And where do you find the space with the kind of specialized facilities, at least for the very early stages, before the company has gotten that large capital to create its own space and build its own buildings?
That's wonderful. I really appreciate that, Bob. The patient capital aspect, and then also the space, the physical space, and also the latitude to explore and innovate over a longer time frame, I think is quite valuable. And then thinking as well as the technology scales to a pilot testing, how might you demonstrate that from the lab to the field in a way that can rapidly transition? And I know there's a few universities like ours that have those types of facilities. Like my facilities, we can test up to 500 kilowatts grid active. I know some of my colleagues at Colorado State University can do up to 2 megawatts in their hybrid natural gas hydrogen reactor. Or combustion turbine, I should say, sorry. And so looking at the future of fusion, Bob, with you and your spearhead and team there is going to be absolutely fascinating, not only for that technology and that future energy system, but how might your example provide models for other universities and industries to partner together to usher in the change that we need? Excellent. Thank you, Bob. I wanted to kindly turn it over to Tracy and Tom. I really appreciated what you were talking about when not just capturing the CO2 and not just what you could do with the CO2, but the overall value chain and business model. So how do you create an economy around CO2 that drives the change we want to see? So feel free, my friends, to come off mute and tell us a little bit more about how you're exploring developing a value chain and an economy for CO2.
Tom, do you want to take a first swing at that?
Tracy. So first of all, there are parts of that value chain that are fairly tractable if we can have well-paying markets, and we have them right now. The California low carbon fuel standard was running for several years at $200 a ton of CO2. It's now backed off to about $150. That's still plenty of money to really drive innovation. Unfortunately, it's not long-term money. It's a market, and prices can fluctuate and rules can change. So I think that's going to be important for getting that long-term capital that Bob was just talking about in the game. But I do think that there are pieces where the numbers are pretty strong. However, especially in these natural systems that I was describing, there's a lot of parts that there's a lot of uncertainty about. soil carbon, how much losses there are going to be. If you use something like a biochar, for example, how long is that carbon going to be around? Geologic carbon storage, we've got really good numbers for, but some of the other pieces, there's going to be uncertainty about the lifespan of that carbon storage, and also the so the permanence, but also the actual quantities that are going to be stored. And that creates uncertainty, and that's something that markets really don't like. So we can expect a discounting, pretty heavily discounting of those areas where there is uncertainty. And that's where some of the AI tools and the blockchain tools and some of the market supply chain tools that are now being established in other sectors are going to be really important in the energy and carbon sector as well. Tracy, back to you.
All right. Well, then, first, a quick callback to the prior question, which I just wanted to add location for some of the incubation of emerging companies and startups. I just want to say it's particularly important. And then in Houston, we've actually adopted an idea that actually was pioneered by Harvard and MIT, was set up the Greentown Lab structure here, which provides a large centralized area with prototyping, 3D printers, and an opportunity for small startup companies to all collaborate and share ideas. It's been very successful. So we're very excited about where that's going to go. To answer this question, I think I'd offer two layers. Obviously, the central dilemma for transitioning into the post-carbon economy and also, frankly, decarbonizing existing carbon reserves in the atmosphere is what to do with the CO2. Two things. First, there's been an enormous surge of activity and interest, in part not only because of the low carbon fuel standard and because of the prior 45Q tax credit, but also with the now Inflation Reduction Act, we've bumped up direct air capture CO2 credits to $185 a ton. And with direct payment on a 5-year scale for corporations, but also open-ended for nonprofits. That has been enormously fertile for companies who projects that would have been on the drawing board are now suddenly viable. And we're seeing a lot of interest in sort of figuring out how to make that in a way that is going to be sustainable. The second, however, is that's a creature of legislation and tax incentives. So the real answer is what can we physically do with the CO2 that makes a useful product that could consume some of the enormous quantities of CO2 we'll likely have to handle in the upcoming years. Right now, most of that interest is focused on fuels and converting the CO2 into a liquid fuel that can be reused. With life cycle analyses, hopefully either making it at least zero, if not net negative. Other things we're looking at, though, is converting that CO2 into carbon stocks, including things like not just CO2 in the air, but petcoke, to things like graphene or other types of carbon-based novel materials with, that could be dedicated for construction or other types of high-tech electronics. That work's still in the research lab, but that's where the universities are going to play a critical role in terms of actually come up with something that could at least make a dent. I think we'd be realistic, even if we came up with a perfect way to find conversion of some of the CO2 into things like graphene or carbon nanotubes. There still is going to be a mismatch between scale of what we're collecting and what we need to actually consume. But that's going to be a long-range project to solve.
Excellent. Thank you, Tracy and Tom. Then if I could kindly turn it over to you, Ted, and when you're talking about the application of AI to diagnose meter outages, I'm sure that the attributes of artificial intelligence have potentially additional use cases in the power sector, distribution, and others. I was wondering if you could give some thoughts, conjectures, or forward-leaning ideas and thought leadership for where folks on the Horn might see applications of AI start to permeate their sections of the industry.
Sure. I think that there are a couple of opportunities, mostly focusing on, either avoiding the use of resources or as a replacement for using resources. So in the meter case, you're not only saving the time for a meter tech to go out, you're also saving the resources that they would have needed to go out to the site. So you're avoiding expending resources, and you're also saving that person's time. So I think we've got a lot of applications. Some of them have been mentioned today. So the Director White mentioned before, the nexus between natural gas and electricity. I think we've done a lot of useful modeling looking at some of the consequences for, let's say, dispatch schedules for natural gas and dispatch schedules for electricity, and how they don't exactly match up. There's some discrepancies between the two. I think a lot of our data analysis can go a step further and say, do we need to refine, let's say, natural gas dispatch decisions or electricity market rules to better align those? And that's more of a system-wide. And then you have the micro applications. So the unregistered solar panel detection algorithm that I'm working at, it actually can be used for other applications. It can look at commercial losses, theft on the system, and detect that as well. So, and once again, that saves a crew going out to take a look at the facility and see if there is some mechanism in place that is siphoning power off from another part of the system. So it saves a crew going out there. In some areas, it's not very safe for line crews to make site visits. So, you're improving worker safety. So I think a lot of the applications, I think, focus on, avoiding resource use or replacing resource use. The most important thing, though, I think, for all the utilities out there is understanding that you all have great universities right in your backyards, in your states, in your towns. And these universities are full of graduate students, advanced undergrads. They have, more and more, they're getting the tools. They're looking for projects. And if those projects can help you to take a look at something that you don't necessarily have the time to address, take that avenue, find out what's going on with the universities, form partnerships with them. A lot of great universities out there.
Absolutely wonderful, Ted. And I appreciate, again, that continued emphasis of partnerships to continue learning, build human capital, and drive forward ideas and innovation. In closing here, one of the things that I appreciated in hearing from my colleagues is that it helps all of us on the call today reflect on, are we focusing on the right problems and are we asking the right questions? And so thinking back to those global mega trends, systems thinking, how to incubate energy companies and more. So that's extremely valuable. So in that regard, I'd like to ask each of the panelists here to provide just a short, about 15 seconds. What do you think isn't getting sufficient investment? And when I say investment, it's not just financial investment, but also about intellectual leadership and thought, or even the aggregate allocation of human time towards certain efforts. So what do you think is not getting sufficient investment? Ted, let's start back with you.
I think it's really our attention. There are a lot of things that we can focus on. We start focusing as academics. Lots of times we're focusing on things that interest us, and that's great. You should do the things that interest you. But to call back to what I mentioned before, but finding out what are the problems, forums like this, what are the problems that industry is facing? What are the practical problems that people are seeing? I get so much out of talking with utility regulators and operators around the world. And I really don't think that the students have all those opportunities. So I'd like to see, like, the next generation of analysts, let them get more exposure to some of the problems that people are facing around the world.
That's a really good point, Ted, is not spending sufficient attention and time on understanding and addressing the stakeholders and what their specific challenges and problems are. That's really good. Tracy, if I could ask some guidance from you, what are we potentially as a society or individuals not providing sufficient attention to?
All right, well, a two-layered answer. One, and this is one, it is getting attention, we haven't talked about today in our panel. Universities, I think, play a critical role in terms of making sure that it includes voices and perspectives that don't get included sometimes. So to the extent that we need to be reaching out to universities in the developing side of the world, or alternatively incorporating environmental and energy justice issues into these discussions for emerging technologies, That's a role we have to play, and it's hard for others to play. So just as long as we keep sight of that dimension. Of course, now Ted made the valid point that we tend to think what we're interested in is the area people should be paying attention to. So with that, I will offer up one thing I don't think folks are paying much attention to, that I think is going to be becoming increasingly important in terms of the near term, is if climate disruptions do start materializing in ways that pose imminent or emergency situations, we're going to have to start focusing on policy responses that aren't long-term for climate, but things that can be done now. And there are some technologies that are being in the wings that are being considered that can help respond to those situations. But most of the discussion is mired on the global scale discussion, not applying them locally or regionally, which is where I think the action is going to be. So that's probably a discussion for another panel another day, though.
Perfect. Thank you, Tracy. Tom, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things, but I guess I really feel like the two most important things people need to understand are, one, this is a problem we can solve. Okay, the energy transition is possible. There's a host of technologies. There's a host of solutions that are either proven or are very promising. And that portfolio approach that was talked about repeatedly this morning is going to work. But it's still a hard problem. And it will take a whole of society effort to make that transition. And that includes a lot of attention to people whose lives will be disrupted because the things that they've done for their lives in the energy business or in sort of supporting industries are going to change. And I think that sort of, there's certainly a lot of talk about that in some of the new federal programs that were talked about earlier. But actually making that real so that we can solve this in a way that feels right to all of the communities around the country and around the globe.
Thank you, Tom. Bob.
So I think the other panelists have hit some of the main topics. I think let me just resonate with the need to reach out to people who have inadequate access to energy, whether that's abroad, and there's a lot there, but also domestically, communities that are economically challenged and don't have good access to energy. I think that requires a different approach than we typically take. I think it requires a lot of in-person interviewing and coupling closely with those communities. And it's not clear to me how you scale that up, but I think that's going to be a big challenge that requires us to invest in people to make those connections. I think on the technology side, we need not to forget that we don't have all the technologies we need yet for the future system that we will need to depend on. I think dispatchable zero emissions power is one of them. The zero carbon fuels that we will need for the system. I think we have a lot of good ideas out there, but we're not there yet. And it is the cheapest part of the value chain, frankly, to invest in, is that early stage research. But we can't forget that. And then we need to, I think, up the investment, as we talked earlier, in moving the ideas out of the lab and scaling them up.
It's really good, Bob. Thank you. And then for me to lean in from a topical standpoint, in enhancing use of variable renewable energy for grid connected and off-grid locations, and also providing energy access to remote locations, a topic that I think is deserved but has disproportionately limited focus on it is unelectrified urban populations due to refugees, climate migration, shantytown settlements, and more, and informal settlements that is significantly increasing but has gotten just a minimal amount of attention to date. And so I'd recommend to the group reflect and think about that and how you could engage in those topics. And we'll be happy to follow up offline on that too. I'd love to conclude just again by thanking the panelists here today. It's been a rewarding time to moderate the dialogue, to spend time with you, and to share time with everyone on the call with us today. And so, Sheila, I think that to bring the baton metaphor back into the forefront ends our 5x100, and I'll hand over things back to you to conclude our segment.